This book discusses moral and philosophical issues in relation to animals. The idea of animal liberation is not to invoke sad emotions for harm done to many different animals, or to treat animals kinder simply because they're cute and amusing, but by using pure logic and reason, come to the conclusion that in order to uphold ideas of true equality, we must extend our moral sphere of consideration to not just all humans, but all animals as well. I'm sure everyone in this room is a staunch opponent towards ideas like racism and sexism. If you look at why ideas like racism and sexism are viewed as very unfavorable, it is because we have come to the conclusion that human equality is a moral idea, not an assertion that all humans are equal in every single way. What I mean by that is, there may be observable differences among races and sexes, and people in general, whether they're biological, physical, or mental. These differences don't appear in every single case, but can appear when averages of a population are taken. Despite this fact, we don't believe that one race or sex is better than another, simply because there is a difference in intelligence, moral capacity, physical strength, or some other arbitrary characteristic. We as humans have come to believe that we should consider how our actions affect other people, regardless of what they may look like or what their abilities are. If we believe it is right to consider the interests of all humans, no matter how different they may be from us, this belief requires an extension of consideration to all animals as well. This is because, along with racism and along with sexism, the idea of speciesism must also be condemned on the grounds that all these ideologies advocate for baseless discrimination. Think of it like this. Speciesism is defined as an attitude of bias in favor of the interests of one's own species and against those of members of another species. Thomas Jefferson once argued that because Sir Isaac Newton was superior to others in understanding, he was not, therefore, lord of the property or master of all people. Therefore, if possessing a higher degree of intelligence does not entitle one human to use another human for his own ends, how can we allow humans to exploit non-humans for the same exact reason? I spoke earlier of the concept of interests. Upholding true equality is not about advocating for equal or identical treatment towards all species, but advocating for equal consideration of all species. This means we must be able to observe the differences between the intelligence, instincts, and characteristics of all species. When that is done, we quickly come to realize that the interests of one species can dramatically differ from the interests of another. For example, if we were to consider the interests of a human boy growing up in America, showing a concern for his interests would mean teaching him how to read and write to adequately prepare him for a successful life in our society. On the other hand, considering the interests of a pig would only mean that we leave the pig with other pigs in a place where there is adequate food and room to run freely. The idea is, the basic element of taking into account the interests of the being, whatever those interests may be, must, according to the principle of equality, be extended to all beings, black or white, male or female, human or non-human. I mentioned earlier that we allow humans to exploit non-humans. The reason we, as a society, allow this behavior is because most human beings are speciesists. The truth is, most ordinary human beings who are otherwise good people take an active part in and also allow their taxes to pay for practices that violate the interests of certain species to serve the most trivial interests of their own species, the human race. Over years, tens of millions of many Western societies' tax dollars go towards animal experimentation, many of which inflict severe pain without the slightest prospect of significant benefits for humans or any other beings. This kind of behavior most people would agree is wrong, but let's say that animal experimentation could prevent diseases and viruses from hurting us, therefore benefiting our lives. That would justify the experiments then, wouldn't it? The answer is still no. The ethical principle of equal consideration of interests would rule out immoral means of obtaining knowledge, especially if there are alternatives which produce no suffering. Pursuing knowledge does not justify treating other beings immorally. We do not believe that scientists have a right to perform painful or lethal experiments on human beings without their consent, even though such experiments on humans would advance knowledge far more efficiently than if the experiment was performed on a rabbit or a mouse. So you may be wondering, how can I adequately consider the interests of all animals, or what changes can I make today? Well, there are multiple things of importance, like contacting our political representatives about the issues of animal welfare, making our friends aware of these issues, teaching young children to consider all beings, and protesting on behalf of exploited non-human animals whenever the chance to do so arises. While these are all viable options in striving towards equality, there is one action that is of supreme importance in reducing animal suffering. It's an action that gives meaning to all actions on behalf of animals, and would remove those who fight for animals of any hypocrisy. This step is ceasing to eat animals. This is mostly due to the practices of the modern factory farming industry, which is the primary source of our meat, and this industry's inconsiderate, cruel tendencies towards non-human animals. The 5 basic freedoms of many animals are this: to turn around, to groom, to get up, to lie down, and to stretch the limbs freely. Despite these being the most simple of interest to consider, all these freedoms are still denied to all caged hens, all sows in stalls and tethers, and all veal calves in crates. This is just one example of how modern production of meats does not consider the welfare of animals in the slightest. Consuming the products from this business shows that we indirectly condone and support the immoral actions taken to provide us with meat. The concept of animal liberation is very significant, in the way that the change can come from us and only us. All other welfare and rights movements have often started after an oppressed group has had enough unfair treatment. But animals are unable to organize and fight for their own rights and consideration, like humans were able to during the civil rights movement or the struggle for women's suffrage. Humans have the power to continue the exploitation and abuse of other species until the end of time. Despite this fact, progress has still been made thanks to many animal welfare organizations and protests. But the struggle for animals is still far from being over. The only way fundamental change can happen is for us to realize as a whole species that our behavior and attitudes towards animals are morally indefensible. The change towards good must come from the same species that is committing the tyranny, and if we wish to eradicate immorality and injustice wherever it may be found, we must first extend consideration to all living beings rather than just our own species.